we're going to try to, maybe we'll try to crush these first three here, and then maybe revisit our fundamental questions after that, see if we've sort of made some progress there. So let's take a look at this one. Now, if you've never seen this before, if you're not familiar with the environment here, basically the main things is we've got the right panel over here, we've got the left panel over here. The left panel is kind of telling you what to do. It's kind of giving you like a description of the problem. It's giving you all the information you need in order to get it done. The right panel is where you're actually going to do it. This is where you're going to write your code. This is where we're going to type it all out. We're going to run our tests, and we'll talk about those in more detail in just a sec. But those are sort of the main two parts of the view here. I also kind of, just from a design perspective, I want to talk a bit about this panel up top. You might have noticed, like, we still have like our number of coins, our alerts and stuff like that, kind of our like profile details, that sort of thing. We've got the name of the challenge, but we don't really have the stuff we had before. Like, for example, if I go back, you notice I've got this kind of nav panel thing, leaders, forums, that sort of thing. So we don't have that. We also don't have like this code friends thing. Like, there's chat windows we can enter, but none of that appears when we're actually in the view of the task itself. And I actually really like that. I don't know if it was an intentional design feature, but I think it really helps get you kind of immersed in the problem without a lot of distractions. So that's kind of a neat thing. Okay, so let's talk about what this problem is actually asking us to do, this particular problem, and then we'll talk about what tools we'll need to solve that. So
Write a function that returns the sum of two numbers.
okay, so I guess the first thing I should point out here is there is going to be a lot of math in a lot of these tasks. Programming, essentially, it's applied math. It's an application of math. So math is kind of like the fundamental underpinning of what programming is all about. So there's definitely going to be a lot of math in here. If you're not super math oriented, or if you don't have a lot of experience with it, I mean, don't super worry about that. If you have questions, definitely feel free to ask. I mean, they'll throw in math terms here and there, like a quotient or a dot product or something like that, and it might be a little tricky, but the main thing is all those have definitions, and we can work through those. So right off the bat, we see the word sum here. In case you're not familiar, sum means it's the result of an addition, and you can probably get that from the title as well. Add. We're adding two numbers. That's what we're going to be doing. So this is I mean, this task isn't exactly rocket science. It's going to be kind of a softball challenge, but it's the first one after all. So they are going to ascend in complexity from here. They're going to get more challenging. But the main thing is that I want to use this as an opportunity to sort of answer some questions you might have about just what we're actually looking at, how we're actually going to make our program do that thing. So some of the things I want to talk about today are, and I'll just start a list over here now. When you're programming, in JavaScript anyway, if you want to do a comment, we're just going to do these 2 forward slashes. So these are the topics we're going to be looking at. We're going to start with variables. We're going to talk about functions. Those are kind of the main 2 things that we'll talk about for this this first one here. So basically, just starting with the first part here, variables. So what's a variable? And also, you might notice, like, if you've got some math experience, both of these are words that we see within the context of math. So in math, usually a variable is kind of like an unknown number, like an x or something like that. Like it has a value, we don't know the value of it. In programming, it's going to be a little bit different. It's not specifically going to be a number necessarily. In fact, this sort of gets us into this idea of data types. So in JavaScript, I think we have 6 data types. We've got numbers, strings, booleans, we've got arrays, objects, and we've got functions. So we're going to talk about all these, what they do. Some languages are a little more specific about breaking down what a number is. Like some of them will specifically say, well, you've got an integer or a floating point value. JavaScript isn't really too picky about that stuff. I mean, a number is a number as far as we're concerned. There isn't much of a difference between like the number 7 or the number 0.9. It's not really going to make a distinction between those two very much. So whereas that is kind of a big deal in some other languages. Okay, so we'll start with some variables here. I mean, notice we are sort of within a function right now, and we'll talk about what that means in just a sec. But if we want to declare a variable, if we want to say like, hey, here's a new variable, we're going to use the keyword var, and then we're going to give our variable a name. So we can call it whatever we want. We're going to call this variable Mike. It's a quick example. We could change this, but for now, we're going to call this one Mike. And Mike is just going to be, let's say, a number. So we're going to put in a value for this. Let's just make Mike some random number here, and we're going to finish every line with a semicolon. That's kind of, I mean, it's actually not super essential in JavaScript, but it's a good practice to get into. It's basically, it's telling it's telling the program this is where this line ends. You know, it's not going to go on from there. So we could actually put other stuff over here, you know, like declare another variable, put another line there, but that's not really nice. So we're just going to go on to the next line from there. So generally, most lines are going to end with a semicolon. It's kind of the good practice. But JavaScript is very forgiving about that. In fact, JavaScript it's just a very forgiving language overall. So it's kind of nice to work in, but that can be to your detriment as well. Anyway, the point is we're going to get into those details. So for now, we've got this variable Mike. In terms of what our function is doing, well, let's talk about what a function is actually. If you remember from math, usually a function is kind of like an input-output system. So something goes in, something comes out. So like, for example, if we wanted to do an example of a function, let's say we've got this function and it's called f. And basically the idea is, well, it's kind of like a machine. You know, you've got things that go into it, and then you've got some things that are going to come out of it on the other end. So maybe our function is, it's the add1 function, okay? So it's just a function that's going to take a number and it's going to add 1 to it. So if we put in, for example, let's say the number 5, then as an output, it'll spit out the number 6. If we were to put in, let's say, maybe we'll choose a negative number for this next one. So we'll say -3. We're adding 1 to that, so it's going to be -2. -3 plus 1 is -2. Okay, so maybe we want to get kind of a formula for this function. So usually the notation in math is we'd say something like this: f at x is equal to x plus 1. So basically the idea here is that our x, this part, is our input, and then all of this here is our output. So this goes in, this comes out. So that's sort of the math way of talking about functions. In programming, we'll do it a little bit differently. So basically, the input is going to be in parentheses. So that's actually, these are the inputs over here. This function is called add. It has 2 parameters. We call these parameters, they're the inputs of a function. And basically the idea is that these are 2 parameters. We can interact with those. But instead of just writing it like this, I mean, we have to specifically say that we're returning something. So in this case, I just want to say return Mike. Okay, so basically when we run our function, I'm going to run the tests here. When we run the function, notice we're getting this value. It's equal to Mike over here. And if we were to change Mike to, I don't know, some other random number here, then when we run it, that's basically what we're going to get back. And notice we're getting that back in every one of our test cases. Output is the same for each one of these. Well, we actually can't see this one. Those are the hidden tests I was talking about before. So we're really just interacting with these first 2. So notice that's not the expected output, because they're kind of giving us these 2 parameters. It's parameter 1, parameter 2, and they're expecting to get 3 because that's 1 plus 2. We want to be adding these 2 things together. So we're not really returning the right thing. I'm just sort of trying to demonstrate how these variables work. And you know, like, we could make this something different too. It doesn't have to be a number. A variable can hold another data type. It could be a string or a boolean. We'll talk about each of those. So basically just returning a string now. If we wanted a boolean, boolean is kind of like a true or false value, and we'll talk later about how we're going to use those things. We could even do something like this. So Mike is assigned the value of param1. Param1, it's our first parameter. It's basically the first input of the function. So if we're looking at our example over here, param1 would be 1. Param2 would be 2. So in this case, if we're saying Mike is assigned the value of param1, then basically Mike as a variable is holding the same value that param1 is. So in this first case, param1 is 1. That means Mike should be param1, it should be 1. And therefore, when we return Mike, we should be returning 1. So if we run these tests, we should get 1 back for the first one. There we go, 1. And then the second test, it was 0, so we should get 0 back. Okay. So the funny thing about that is, since that was a 0, we actually would get the right value for the second test if we change this to param2. I mean, it's 0 plus 1,000, that's just 1,000. So if we run this now, we're getting 2 for the first one. But notice the little check marker. We actually are getting the answer right for the second one. So that's just a coincidence, though. It's not going to work for everything. So we've got to do something a little... we've actually got to add the numbers. So basically, we could do something like this. Let's change the name of our variable. So instead of Mike, we're going to call it sum. Sum representing, the addition of the two numbers. And we want to be returning this sum thing here. And specifically, if we're going to be adding these, then we want to add the two together, param1 plus param2. I mean, addition is going to work just like anything else in JavaScript. Like if we did 4 plus 5, for example, then we should get 9 as a result. And there we go. Okay, so we'll do param1, param2. There we go. We'll run this thing, and hopefully it's going to work. Okay. There we go. So it's letting us know you've got it. Go ahead and submit. It's passing all the sample tests. We've got check marks on both of these. So we haven't passed it yet. We're not past this part because we haven't actually submitted. It's possible that it might just happen to pass these tests, but then fail on one of the hidden tests. That does happen sometimes, and so we don't want to get too confident at this point. But we are passing the test so far. Anyway, the point is, I do want to talk a little bit more about some of these data types before we move on. An array is basically a way of kind of like moving around more than one value at once, doing stuff with more than one value at once. So like, for example, we could do something like var r for array it's an array containing like 3, 9, -7, 0. Okay, so that's basically just something we can interact with now, and we could say something like return, well, we'll try this first, return array. Oh, by the way, I just used a keyboard shortcut. That's Control R or Command R. That'll run the tests for you. Okay, so notice I'm just getting this array. It's just a bunch of values, but maybe I don't want all of them. Maybe I just want like the third one here. So I'll do r at 3. I'll use these square brackets here, put in my 3, and that should give me the third element. So I'll run the test. I expect to get -7, and oh, that's weird. So I'm getting 0 here. That's kind of strange. I wonder why I'm getting 0. Well, this is the first kind of counterintuitive thing that we're going to notice, and this is one of the most important things you'll want to be keeping in mind. When we're looking at the indices for the array, so this is 3, 9, -7, 0. Let's clear this. Yeah, I think I'm sure. Okay, so we had 3, 9, -7, and 0. So in terms of the indices, like the indexes for an array, it always starts with 0. So we'd actually say this is the 0th element, not the first one. And then from there it goes 1, 2, 3. So I thought I was talking about the third element before when I was referencing it with the 3, but it turns out I was actually talking about technically the fourth element, but the element with index 3. And that happened to be a 0. So that's why we got a 0 back over here. So always keep that in mind. When we're talking about an index, when we're talking about an array, the index will always start at 0. That's really, really important. So that's what an array is. An object, it's kind of a similar thing, except we don't need to we're not, our indices aren't going to be 0, 1, 2, and 3 necessarily. They can be whatever we want. Oh, actually, one more thing I just want to point out. You might be wondering, like, well, why isn't this executed? Why isn't this returning stuff? Basically, the thing about a function is that anytime you return something for the function, that function's done. So we're returning this value. It's not going to execute any of this stuff down here. I mean, this is the same thing effectively. So we don't actually need to worry about this stuff down here for now. But just so that it doesn't look too cluttered, I'm going to comment it out. So there's actually another way we can do commenting in JavaScript. If you want to comment out like a large block of code, then basically we would use this. So it's /*, and then we'll end with */. Okay, so right now we're returning array at 3. Really what we wanted was array at 2, and this should give us that -7 that we were looking at. Okay, great. Now we can also use an object. So instead of, let's say, obj, short for object, we'll use a different bracketing style. So we're going to use these curlies here, and basically instead of just listing our elements, so instead of just like 3, 9, each of these is going to have specific keys. So we'll say like maybe first is going to be 3 and second is going to be 9. And then from there we can return obj, and we'll see what happens there. So there's our object. First is 3, second is 9. And then, we could try to do something like, okay, well, let's return the 0th element, and we'll try to run that. It's going to say null. It's saying, what's the 0th element you're talking about? We don't have something with a key called 0. We have something with a key called first. And this is kind of an important detail. So notice how I'm putting first here in quotation marks. That's because it's a string. So if I don't put the quotation marks, it's going to think I'm talking about a variable called first, like obj is a variable. So I'm pretty sure it's not going to run. Yeah, so first is not defined. We don't have a variable called first. We have a key called first, and that's a string. Another way we could do this is we could do object dot first, and that's going to give us the same property. That's going to give us the 3. Oh, that happens to be the right answer. That's lucky. But anyway, that's kind of overall how objects work. I mean, we could store other things in here, other data types. What's up? And then dot second, it'll return what's up. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so basically that's the idea here. I mean, we can put whatever data types we want, but usually we'll use like arrays and objects if we want to deal with kind of a lot of data at once, potentially different types of data, but basically the idea is we can use that to manage kind of groups of data all at once. Anyway, I don't want to get too deep into that stuff right now. We will definitely revisit those a lot more in the future, but one last thing I just want to say about this is I want to talk about functions. So a function, again, we talked about it as this input-output system, but there's more to this. There's more than this to JavaScript. Like this isn't everything. If we look at where JavaScript usually lives, I'll show you an example. So basically, this would be an example of a website here. This is the code for it. This is very, very simple. This is the site itself. Notice, like, we've got a lot of this style thing here. This is all CSS. We've got, well, HTML is going through the whole thing. I mean, that's what we see right at the beginning. This is basically how websites are built. JavaScript is a natural language of the internet. It's traditionally what we would use if you want to make a website that does stuff. So notice, like, we've got a few functions over here. We've got this one, we've got this one. They're not executing just right off the bat. Our page isn't making these things happen until we actually call the function. So I put in this line over here, which is basically sort of telling us when we click this thing, it's going to execute this function over here, which is just a little alert. So we click that, it says, hey, what's up? So basically, this is just one function. It's part of a much larger thing. This is what I'm trying to say. So we're really just zooming in on kind of like this part of it, just the function itself. And that's kind of another thing that's really nice about codefights, that it allows you to just sort of zoom in on the functional part of it, just building the functions, just working with the programming language. So I think this was working. from what I remember before. We were able to run the tests, and we were able to pass at least the first 2 tests. It makes sense. I mean, we're just calculating the sum here. It's pretty straightforward. It's just adding our 2 numbers here, our 2 parameters, and then it's returning the sum. So, I don't know why the tests aren't running right now. Maybe we'll just refresh the page. Let's copy that in case. So we'll do a quick refresh, and hopefully it'll work from there. In the meantime, what else can we talk about? Well, parameters. Parameters are kind of like variables that we don't have to declare. Like notice over here we had to say var sum. Like we're giving it a name, then we're assigning it a value. We actually don't have to do those 2 things at the same time either. Like we could declare that there is a variable called sum and then give it a value later. Okay, so that's reloaded. Let's see if the tests are going to run now. Perfect. Okay, so we're passing all the sample tests, and now we're going to try submitting this just to see if we're going to pass. But I'll delete this stuff, because the thing is, when you run this, when you submit it, it's basically going to get saved to the solutions over here. Like notice there's a lot of solutions to this one. This is 68,545 solutions. A lot of people have solved this one, and we can kind of, like, this is another one of these features. You can spend some coins, get a hint. You can sort of let you see parts of their solution before completing it. If we tried to click on one of these, notice it's telling us we can't see these until the task is solved. So let's actually submit our own solution here. We'll see if it works. And okay, great, task solved. So we get some experience points from that. We're part of the way to completing our goal. If we hit continue, it'll move on to the next task, but I don't want to do that right now. I just kind of want to stay here for just a minute. So first of all, we submitted our solution. So now if we look at the list of solutions, it should actually be in there, and I think it should be the most recent one. I guess that's not really loading up for now, so maybe we'll look at that in a sec. But while we wait for that, let's take a look at our code here. You know, maybe there's a more efficient way we could write this. So we've got var sum, assign the value of param1 plus param2. What I was saying before is we could do something like this, where we actually just say var sum, like just declare it, and then afterwards assign the value to it. So this is basically saying sum is something that exists, that's carving out a space in memory for this variable sum to have a value. And then we're telling it what that value is. We're actually assigning the value to it. And then finally, we're returning it as kind of the answer, the result of our function here. So if we run the tests on this, it should work exactly the same way as what we had before. Oh, well, there's the solutions anyway. So, oh, hey, look at that. So, in the time that we did that, someone else actually submitted their solution. So, where's another JavaScript? So, this user has another JavaScript. Hey, look at that. So, they actually used a lot less, a lot fewer lines than we did. If we look at our solution, it's we've got sum, and then we've got param1. So let's see if we can't refine our solution a little bit here. I mean, basically this param1 plus param2, that's what we're trying to store here. You know, like that's what we're storing in sum, and then we're returning sum. We could sort of cut out the middleman. We don't really need sum at all. We don't need for it to be a thing. We could just say, well, let's return this. Let's return param1 and param2, and we'll see if that's going to work just the same way. Yeah, that's totally fine. And so, you know, maybe that's a better way of doing it, because we're not using an extra variable. We're not putting that extra variable in memory. So memory is one of these things that you sort of want to be considering as we're writing algorithms. Now, there are other ways to do this. There's kind of like a more modern notation that's going to look a bit more like the math notation for a function that we're looking at before. Like I said, I mean, these are input-output systems. So this is an ES6 thing. It's kind of like a modern JavaScript. It's a more recent JavaScript syntax. But we're going to say that add is something that takes param1 and param2, and it basically executes this function with it, which just returns param1 and param2. So that's a little more terse in terms of the syntax. It doesn't take as much to write it out like this. In fact, we can even tighten it up from there. Since it's just returning this one thing, we can just say basically it goes from this to this. This is our input over here, our inputs in this case. This is our output. So when we run the test, this still works. Now, this is called an arrow function. There are some advantages and disadvantages of arrow functions. We'll talk more about those in the future, but I mean, I don't want to get too hung up on this first task. I mean, we've already been talking about it for a while, so there we go. That's still correct. It's still passing all the tests. It still totally works. It's stored our solution in here now, so it's basically updated it. And that's why I wanted to sort of like delete some of the comments and stuff like that, because other people can see this now. They can click on it, and well, as long as they've completed the challenge. You remember before we tried to click one before completing it, it didn't work. All right, so we're going to move on from here. We're going to say next task. All right,